My name is Laura Cox Kaplan, and on behalf of my firm, PricewaterhouseCoopers, it is my honor and privilege to welcome you all here this evening for what I know will be a very enlightening discussion. The evening's program is a really great example of the wonderful work that's happening at the National Women's History Museum under the leadership of Joan Wages and her terrific team. You'll hear from Joan in just a moment, but before you do, I wanted to say just a couple of words about PwC and why we are involved with the museum. PwC believes that the awareness that the museum creates helps us have a much richer dialogue around the economic and societal benefits of diversity. And we see the museum's work in this regard as incredibly important to that cause. Not unlike other endeavors that are dedicated to historical study and analysis, the museum provides us with a really important bridge to the past successes and accomplishments of women. And by making us more aware of these historical accomplishments, the museum helps forge a bridge to the future by engaging each and every one of us to inspire future generations. I currently serve on I currently serve as one of 5 women on PwC's executive leadership team. And for PwC, that is an historic first for us. My sincere thanks to Joan, to her wonderful team, to our terrific panelists who are here this evening, and to George Washington University who is hosting us. Thank you for bringing us all together. And with that, I welcome Joan to the stage.
Well, thank you so much, Laura. That was just a lovely introduction, and we always love hearing glowing words about the purpose of the National Women's History Museum, so thank you very much. We also want to thank the program committee that has worked so hard to bring this whole series together. That includes the George Washington University History Department, the Global Women's Institute, which is led by Dr. Mary Ellsberg, the GW Women's Studies, and GW's Development Office. So thank you very much to all the work that's been put into bringing this series together. And of course, we thank PricewaterhouseCoopers. We are delighted to have your support and to be partnering with you to help raise awareness about women's history. Our next lecture is going to be on February the 19th, and we hope you will plan to join us. It is entitled Game Changers, American Women in Sports. Dr. Bonnie Morris, who is here with us this evening, is going to be one of our panelists. So we are sure it will be a very lively discussion, and we hope you all can attend. If you are not already a member of the museum, there are brochures outside and at the check-in table, and we would welcome you as a charter member. So now it is my pleasure to introduce our moderator for this evening. She is the chair of the board of the Foundation for the National Archives. She's vice chair of Columbia University Board of Trustees. She is a veteran news executive, including the DC Deputy Bureau Chief for ABC News, and an accomplished author and biographer of Madam C.J. Walker. Please welcome Ms. A'Lelia Bundles.
Thank you very much, and I think we're all here because we know how important the National Museum of Women's History is and will be, and to be able to, even before there's a building, to be able to convene women and bring us together to talk about important issues. So it's my pleasure to introduce our panelists this evening. Dr. Pamela Laird is professor and chair of the History Department at the University of Colorado in Denver. She is also the author of Pull, Networking and Success Since Benjamin Franklin. She obviously has expertise in this. We'll be getting lots of tips this evening and lots of historical perspective. We also have Daryl McKissick, who is chairwoman of the board of McKissick & McKissick, a multi-generational family business and construction. And Daryl and I have known each other for a long time, so it was a delight when I heard she was here. And Pam tells me that she knows a lot about Madam Walker, and so I'm really looking forward to reading her book, and I'm glad she's apparently already read mine. So, you know, when you write a book, you just love it when somebody actually has read what you've written. So I'm just going to set the stage a little bit this evening. I mean, some of this you know, but for many generations, women didn't work outside the home unless they had to. And so many people in the room probably grew up with mothers who were at home. My mother always worked, and generations of my women in my family always worked. And throughout American history, women really worked whether it was considered proper or not. I was at Colonial Williamsburg over the weekend, and I saw women who were working as wig makers and who were working as servants. We know during colonial America there were women who were raising indigo and women who were printers and who were doing all kinds of things that we just didn't learn about in our history books growing up. In the late 19th century, more women were working. Of course, immigrant women almost always worked. They were often the maids and the washerwomen. We know about the tragic Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, where lots of immigrant women were working, not being paid properly. So there's always been work. And then, of course, there was work inside the home. It just wasn't always paid work. So women have always worked in one way or another. And then in the 1960s and 1970s, I'm certainly one of those women who was a recipient of the change that began to happen then. I graduated from college in 1974, when the world was opening up for women and people of color in corporations and in the military. So we began to see those kinds of changes. Women were getting into professional school. When I first started in college, there were very few women in medical school and law school. By the time I graduated, those numbers had really exploded. And so there were two key government acts. There are lots of things, lots of federal legislation that made a difference, but the Civil Rights Act of 1964 made it illegal to discriminate on the basis of race, color, religion, and national origin in employment decisions. And really, as kind of a last-minute act to sort of kill the bill, many people think, Representative Howard W. Smith of Virginia threw in the provision to prohibit discrimination on the basis of sex. He thought then nobody would vote for that, and so he just thought this wouldn't pass. Well, he was really fooled, wasn't he? Prior to the Civil Rights Act, it was common to see newspaper ads that had women wanted, men wanted. Some of us are old enough to remember that. And then in 1974, the Equal Credit Opportunity Act prohibited credit discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, national origin, sex, marital status, age, or receipt of public assistance. And some of you may know that Congressman Lindy Boggs just died not long ago. Her daughter, Koki, and I were colleagues at ABC News, but Lindy Boggs is the person who made sure that there was no discrimination against women getting credit. And those of you who knew anything about Lindy Boggs, if you don't, if you're young enough not to know about her, or you just don't know about her, Google her, look at some of her videos. She is a woman to be known and to be reckoned with. But she had replaced her husband in Congress after he died tragically in an airplane crash in Alaska. And she had that sort of, iron will of a gracious Southern woman. And when the men hadn't included discrimination on the basis of sex in the Credit Act, she went by and wrote it in by hand and said, I know that you just left this out by mistake. And then they had to pass it because they all loved Lindy. So to get things started, Pam, I would like for you to give us a historical view of women in business over the last century, how have things changed? And then we're going to talk a little bit about what difference credit made for women. But let's start with the historical overview.
Well, thank you. And I have to say, you are a wonderful historian. Alelia has already covered a wonderful summary. So what I'd like to add to that are some of the questions about judging women at work and protecting women at work and about conditions. So as Aurelia said, women have always worked, and the differences have a lot to do with class. So one of the things I like to do in teaching is to give a very broad way of categorizing class. So there are a very small number of women who didn't have to work. Very rare, upper class. Then you have women who worked in the home without getting any remuneration for it, and women who worked in the home for money, and so you've got women running boarding houses, having millinery shops. About half of the people who lived in cities in the late 1800s lived in boarding houses, and women were running those, and doing laundry and cooking. And then you had women, of course, who worked outside of the home as well, either free or in bondage before the Civil War. And then you also have a shift in conditions, so that if we think about propriety, what was a proper role for women? So even though you've got most women working, it wasn't considered proper, but that's actually a Victorian contribution to our culture, I should say, because it was perfectly proper for women to work outside the home. Think Betsy Ross, for example. We don't actually know if Betsy Ross made the first American flag, but we do know that she ran an upholstering business, and so she was perfectly capable of doing it. And she went to the same church that George Washington did, so nice circumstantial evidence, but we don't know for sure. In any case, but we do know that there were a lot of women working who had their own businesses, working in other businesses, working in family businesses. And then in the 19th century, we got this notion, somebody got this notion, that it wasn't really proper for women to be working for money, and better yet, not working at all, so servants were nice, if you could, nice work if you can get it. And then we've got a number of changes taking place. So we've got industrialization, creating other opportunities for women outside of cleaning somebody else's house. And then you also have new technologies coming to the fore. So you've got typewriters, telephones, people doing the telephone operating, retail stores, department stores. All of these created opportunities for women that were respectable. But the trade-off for these respectable positions was that they were not supposed to be married. So this made things difficult for a lot of women, obviously. So, and then you move into the early 20th century, and you've got more protections for women in the workplace, which sometimes caused problems later on, because there were people, for example, who refused to support the Equal Rights Amendment, like Eleanor Roosevelt for many years, because they thought it would take away protections for women in the workplace. And so you've got a class difference. So women saying, if you're a working class woman, you should not support the Equal Rights Amendment because women have special protections. And then women who are not worried about that said, well, no, we want everything equal for everybody. So this was a real difficult problem, which is not why the Equal Rights Amendment didn't pass, I should point out. But in any case, then in the mid-20th century, we get a dramatic change with, as Aurelia mentioned, the Civil Rights Act. And that coincided, not entirely coincidentally, with the federal approval for birth control, the pill. And, I mean, there had always been birth control, but nothing quite so able to separate reproduction from sexuality. And this mattered hugely because, as I said before, women were not supposed to work in many respectable positions if they were married. Why? Because they might get pregnant and in public, oh my goodness. So in any case, so there was this dramatic shift with these two coming together, and I think we'll talk more about the impacts of those over the years, and so maybe I'll just call a halt there, but don't forget to ask me about 1980.
I'm taking good notes. But absolutely, I mean, there's, this is a symposium that would be a weekend long. So when the museum opens, we know that there'll be an exhibit on women in business and entrepreneurship. We'll all be back for that. So Daryl, can you talk a bit about sort of the founding story of your family? This is a multi-generational business, totally unusual. Very rarely do businesses go beyond one generation. So how did it start, and how is it that you have stayed involved in the business?
Okay, well, let me start with it's a pleasure to be here tonight and to be a part of the Women's Museum, which I'm so looking forward to. And it's really good to see you again, Alelia. And I've read your book, too. And Pam, I'm looking forward to reading yours. Thanks for
Well,
a copy.
I hope you enjoy it.
But my family goes back 5 generations to my great-great-grandfather, who was a slave builder and passed the trade of building down to my great-grandfather, who passed it to my grandfather. And my grandfather and his brother went to corresponding school to become architects and started our family business in Tennessee in 1905, making us the oldest African-American architectural firm in the country. But, of course, they had plenty of obstacles. When they went to go get their license, of course, it was a question if they could even take the test because, they were black. But they built the governor's mansion. They knew they had built a lot of buildings throughout the state of Tennessee, and they knew a lot of people. So the governor wrote a letter to the licensing board, and we have the original letter that said, even though they're Negroes, they have integrity because they've built this and they've built that, so they should be able to take this test. So they took the test and passed, and we have their original certificates. They're 112 and 113 in the state of Tennessee. And the governor went on to write neighboring states throughout the South so they could take the test in those states as well. So they were the first licensed African-American architects throughout the Southeast. So we designed and built most of the historically black colleges that were throughout the Southeast. There are about 110 of them, maybe less today. But we've probably been on about 35, 40 campuses where they've been there since the beginning, building those campuses. And they did a whole lot more than that. That business was passed to my father, and then he had 3 girls. And he told us to go to school and marry someone to come run his business. And at the same time, though, I think in the back of his mind that he was a great father. But because of the time, that's what people did. But he wanted us to be prepared. Both my parents wanted us to be prepared. And my mother was a very, very strong woman. And so she said, you can always be great architects, engineers. You just have to go and apply yourselves. So we went to school for both architecture and engineering, but I decided to really finish in engineering, so I'm a licensed PE and worked for some construction companies at an interesting time for women. And came up through the ranks that way. My twin sister also did the same thing. My twin sister now runs the Old Line Company. I came out and started my own business over 20 years ago with $1,000. Just wanted to see if I could run my little red wagon all by myself, and built that business up. And so my business is here in Washington, D.C., in Chicago, and Baltimore, and in L.A. So my sister has New York and Philadelphia, and that's how we operate today. So we're trying to cover the nation. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So we'll ask some more questions about advice that you have for other people in sort of traditional male fields. But why don't we get back to reproductive rights? What was the importance of that in giving women flexibility?
As I say, part of it is simply the rules of businesses. I know a woman my age who covered up her pregnancy for 7 months because she knew she would be fired, and once her employer discovered she was pregnant. And there are still prejudices against that in some fields, including engineering, but it's against the law to discriminate based on that. So if a woman can demonstrate that her employers are behaving in this way, then she has a case. But there's as you probably remember from Psychology 101, there's a fight or flight option. And usually what people do is flight rather than fight because of the difficulty of going through the courts. And so one of the opportunities, one of the options that people have had since 1965, a year after the passage of the Civil Rights Act, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission has assisted in that, so people didn't have to be on their own. However, for many years, the EEOC could not actually take a case. So it could provide assistance and advice and do research and so on. But people are still pretty much on their own. But now at least the law protects them. So reproductive rights in that sense, I guess reproductive rights isn't really the issue. Mm-hmm. What is the issue is can an employer discriminate against a woman based on the status of her reproduction life? And one of the things that a lot of enlightened institutions do, including most universities now, is to have parental leave, which includes fathers. Imagine that. And it's wonderful. And I think this is actually, just getting away from business aspect for just a second, one of the greatest benefits of feminist accomplishments has been to allow men to become more engaged in raising their families. And I think this is a huge benefit to our society.
So I'm going to skip down a little bit because you've raised that issue, and there were some numbers that we had, some Pew Research findings about housework and childcare. Not that we need Pew to tell us that women do more of the housework, but this says women perform 16 hours of housework per week and 12 hours of childcare compared to men's 9 hours of housework and 7 hours of childcare. 59% of women now work or are actively seeking employment. 66% of women with children ages 17 or younger work either full-time or part-time. Boy, have things changed. Do both of you have some reflections on the differences between the expectations for men and women now and historically?
Well, I don't think most men do 9 hours of
I was going to say Pew is very optimistic.
Well, keep in mind, this is an average. So there are, we all know very famous women who have house husbands. One of the problems with running a household is that our culture, our society, our legal system is basically set up to have an adult in every household. Now, if you're very rich, you can pay for that adult to be in the household. If you're not, then it has to be one of the adults in the household. And it typically is a woman, but there are women who have greater earning power than their partners, and so the women will go off and the men will be the house husbands, and it can work fine. But one of the reasons why this is a problem, and this actually gets us back to World War II, if I might take the historian's prerogative, and that is that there is a presumption that each family is pretty much on its own for taking care of the children and taking care of the household. There have been many suggestions over the years, going back to the Progressive Era, century and more ago, to set up households in a grouping so that they would share a common kitchen, common laundry room, and so on and so forth, common duties. The washing machine people really didn't like that. And so in the 1920s and 30s, you get a lot of ads say, do you know who's handling your baby's diapers? So you don't even want to send them out to the laundry Of course not, because, oh my gosh, who's handling my baby's diapers? Who's handling the family's underwear? Oh my goodness, this is scary. So I have to have my own washing machine to take care of my own laundry. But this problem actually, so there's that, which is a cultural issue, but there's also been an institutional governmental issue. So for example, in World War II, we all know about Rosie the Riveter, and we know that there were many women in non-traditional jobs during the war. And there were actually people in the legislature, I should point out male people in the legislature, who were quite concerned that this would be too easy for women. And so when there were debates, well, maybe we should have child care centers for women who are building victory ships, for example. There were actually people who said, no, we can't do that. That would make it too easy. They won't want to go back. And then, at the same time, when there were huge criticisms for the rise in juvenile delinquency among the children of women who were building the victory ships. So this was actually a policy decision, and the policies have continued. And so every once in a while, we get someone who writes a book, say, It Takes a Village to Raise a Child, or whatever, something like that title, yes. But we all say, oh, no, we can't do this. It has to be every individual family working on its own, or doing it through some kind of business or something. In other words, there is no community-based solution for the problem.
And so policy is determined on this.
Policy is still, we've gotten away from that raw sexist aspect of it, but we have now in recent decades been succumbing to the individualist bias, and that's causing us trouble as well.
So I'm going to switch to talking about credit, and I have a question for each of our panelists. If we can talk about the Credit Act from your perspective, it's not just about buying shoes. And then for Daryl, we can talk about how you really established credit with your company and how you were able to, from that $1,000. So let's start with Dr. Laird.
One of the realities of business, even very large businesses, multinational corporations, is that they have to borrow money. Businesses do that, and I'm such a coward that it makes me even nervous to think about a house mortgage. But I'm also not as entrepreneurial, for example, as my colleague. So, but in order to run a business, you have to be willing to borrow, and you have to be able to borrow. Because even if you have a stockpile of money, in order to grow beyond that, you have to borrow. And whether you're a farmer planting seeds in the springtime and wanting a new reaper or whatever, you have to borrow. And so when women were unable to borrow without their husband's signature or some other responsible male signature, then it was impossible to grow beyond. So, for example, there is wonderful evidence of women running businesses in the 19th century, but they rarely grew beyond the front porch. In other words, they were in people's houses or say, a storefront, because they couldn't get the credit to grow. And that was a huge block.
So, I just will say, for those of you who are younger than I am, in 1974, when I graduated from college, women could get their own credit cards. And if you were born after that, you have no idea that women couldn't get their own credit cards unless it was in their husband's name. So just think about that.
And I was one of those women. We were talking about it in the back, and I said, "What Credit Act are you talking about?" I had no idea that was going on before my time, but I experienced it even after the law was passed. And in a couple of ways, starting the business, it took forever for me to get my first line of credit. Probably about 3 years, one bank finally, after I went to about 10 banks, gave me a line of credit for $10,000. Wow. Do you know how little that was? I started my business in 1990.
Wow.
$10,000, and they practically wanted me to sign away the child that I knew nothing about. She was coming. She didn't come for another 15 years. But and then I think back on the whole Credit Act, and I've been thinking about it ever since we talked about it in the back. And my story is that I just go back to when I was married. I married someone after I started my business, and I was trying to get a bigger line of credit. So I go to a major bank in town, and I, worked with them for a long time. I put one of my real sales jobs on them. So finally, they said, we're going to give you a real line of credit. And I think it was like $200,000. I mean, that really was going to help, but it was something. And they said, but, the day I had to go down to sign my documents, they said, we want you to bring your husband. And I said, why? And they said, well, we just want him to come sit with you. And I said, well, it's not his company. He has no ownership. I'm 100% stock owner. He's not signing one document. He is not on the line for anything. I am on the line for everything. And they said, do you want this money or not? I told him, go get dressed up. You are going to the bank today.
Wow.
But can you imagine? And I'm sitting here thinking about this whole Credit Act that I knew nothing about. Had I had that piece of information, and I'm going to talk about networking and information, had I had that piece of information, I would have really
Jammed them
threatened
up.
them that day. It would have been a rough day, and I would have walked out of there with $1 million line of credit. But it's just interesting to me that was still going on. And then I think about when I went through the divorce with that husband, and I moved out of our huge home to buy a place. I have the money to buy a place, but I could not get a line of credit. I could not get a mortgage on a house because I was going through a divorce, and they would say, well, we don't know where your money is going to end up. And I would say, but it's my money. It was my money when I went in. It's going to be my money when I come out. And they say no. And I had to actually pay for a place in cash. So I had to go to a 1,000 square foot place after leaving a 8,000 square foot home until my divorce was complete. So I was still being discriminated against and didn't realize this whole Credit Act thing. If I'd known this information.
There's something to be written about that. So this is it's still going on. So we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to networking. Talk a little bit about diversity, the legislation that made it possible, affirmative action, 1980s, and if you'll give us a historical perspective, and then Daryl, if you can talk about what you've observed both in a business, an industry that's mostly a male-dominated industry. But let's get a little historical perspective.
One of the interesting aspects of the relationship between the law and what actually goes on in the world outside the courtroom is that the laws sometimes determine what goes on, or I should say the enforcement of laws. We can have laws, and if nobody's enforcing them, it doesn't matter, sort of like blue laws in Massachusetts. But so what happens in this relationship? So in 1964, Civil Rights Act, the EEOC starts operation a year later. Not much happens. 1973, a major settlement with AT&T that shook up corporate America because at that time AT&T was the largest employer, I should say private employer in the entire world. And so companies said, oh my gosh, if they can get AT&T, they can get anybody. And so, which wasn't exactly true. There were things going on behind the scenes with the FCC and so on, but that's another story. But it had huge impact. And so companies all over the country got really scared and changed their tunes and started putting in sometimes affirmative action plans, even though the Civil Rights Act did not call for affirmative action. Companies started figuring out, well, how else are we going to do this? We've got to do something positive to bring women and underrepresented minorities into our companies. And then things gradually started to change. You got the Bakke decision with the University of California in 78, I think it was. And then, of course, Ronald Reagan was elected in 1980. That was the
1980,
yes. And of course, so starting in 1981, he begins having, encouraging a change in the structure of the Supreme Court. And so gradually during the 80s, you get a reduction in federal support for diversity in the workplace. And then the most wonderful thing happened, and that is that companies and the military and institutions like universities and so on began to say, oh, you know what? It really pays to have women and underrepresented minorities in our companies. And they became the ones pushing, including writing amicus briefs to the court saying, we really need to have diversity. We need to be able to do something about it. And why do we need it? Well, we need it, first of all, because if we are going to bring in new ideas, bring in new perspectives, we need to have new people. And if we are going to market, let's say I'm a company and I'm trying to market and I want to market to women, gee, let's have some women doing the campaigns. If I want to market to non-white populations, I'd better have somebody in there who's got some ideas about how to do this. And so companies really came on board, and there are very few, certainly no universities now, and very few companies that do not have some kind of diversity training for people doing hiring, for example, and making personnel decisions and supervising and so on, so that institutions have figured out, yes, part of it is just covering their bases and staying out of court, but that's okay. I'm good with that. But companies have really figured out that they're better off with this, and institutions, university, the military, and so on.
Right. Though the Supreme Court is pushing back, and there was just this very interesting video that I saw a few days ago that some young black men who are students at UCLA have done a video, and they're saying there are more national championships on the sports teams than there are black men in the freshman class at UCLA, and that's a result of Ward Connerly pushing back and not allowing race to be considered as a factor. So the pendulum keeps swinging back and forth. So Daryl, in engineering and construction and architecture, there still aren't very many women. You managed to move through that, but any stories about overcoming obstacles?
Oh my goodness. Yes, and I've changed tremendously on how I overcome obstacles, and I think that's been the greatest thing. But the obstacles have changed for me over the years. Starting out, of course, I had no money, no contracts, no clients, and so that was the challenge. And so the question, though, is, am I not getting work because I am a minority, because I'm a woman, or is it because I'm a new business starting out and I don't have a track record? And of course, the latter is what's always told to you. But of course, the other two definitely play a role in that. So affirmative action and inclusion has made a tremendous difference in our business, especially to get our foot in the door and to get started. Now that we've evolved, and not only have we evolved as a company, but society as a whole has evolved, just like you said, and it's benefited us because now we do have women and minorities that are high up in corporate America that are making selections on who is going to build their building and who is going to design their building. We have government officials at high places, board members that are saying we need diversity. We want to see women. We have more people that are diverse with money. and wealth that are building buildings and moving into new lease space and saying, I want someone that looks like me to design my space. So it's naturally sort of growing on itself and becoming a reality, what diversity was supposed to do in the beginning. So do we still need diversity rules today? Absolutely. And a lot of them have changed from gender-based and ethnic-based to just a small business base. And you know the whole debacle we had with that, with white males coming in behind their wives and creating a problem. But I think that too has been weeded out very well over the last few years. I just personally believe that diversity is the right thing to do anyway, and it's not just gender-based or ethnic-based, but it's also different types of people coming from different types of places coming all together. It brings strength to a company, and it brings strength to society as a whole. So, but I do have a quick story about how
absolutely.
I've changed, and I'm real proud of that because I used to be very angry about being mistreated. And I'll never forget one time I had an arrangement with a large construction company, and they were mad because the contract that I worked out, it was very lucrative for me. So they decided after about a few months of paying me that they were going to call me in and try to rearrange our contract. So I go in. It's 5 of them sitting around the table and me. I sit down. The first thing he says, the president says, "Oh, another designer bag." Well, that was the first knock, but I just put my bag down and just sat there. And he says, "Well, you know, he tries to come up with why we needed to rearrange this contract." And so I started debating with him, and I was winning the debate. And he really, literally had nothing else to say. So what he said to me was, "I am just not going to make you rich." And it made me so mad. It was just coming up from the inside. I couldn't control myself. Before I knew it, I had socked him in his arm, knocked him out of his chair.
Oh my goodness.
And I told him he was the most arrogant somebody, and I didn't use that word, I had ever met. And then it knocked me back. So I rolled up to the table and I looked at all his cohorts and I said, "Is there anything else I can do for you?" So that was the old Daryl. That's when I had to do.
And you weren't arrested
I had to do
for assault and battery.
Oh, no, I was not. As a matter of fact, I ran into a woman he lived with like 10 years later, and she said he talks about me every day. But then you roll forward, and just recently, this is amazing, ladies and gentlemen, but just recently, I'm in LA, we're going after $1 billion tower, and the client of the tower I know really well. I've met with him. He really wants us on the job. So he said, "Well, Daryl, I'm going to have this meeting, and I'm going to bring in the guy who's the construction person over this job, and we're going to work out how to get you on this job." I said, "Okay, great." So at the meeting, this, what I call a dinosaur, walked in. Crusty guy. He sits down. He says, "Do you know how many words a day women say?" And I looked at him and I said, "Oh, here we go." But I said, "No, I really don't." He said, 25,000 words a day. I said, He said, "Do you know how many words men say a day?" I said, "Can't say I do." He said, 15,000 words a day. So we work all day and we're talking to our colleagues and our clients all day. So by the time we get home, we've expended a lot of words, and we probably have about 2,000 words left to say. But women, they have 25,000 words to say all day long. They've been playing with the babies, baby talk here and there, nobody to really talk to. So we get home and all they can do is talk, 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 talk. He said, "So do you have anything to say?" And I said, "You know what? I don't. I have a corporate video that can say it all." I showed it. So afterwards, I mean, he was so upset because I trumped him on that. he came back with a whole bunch of questions on construction. And he just kept drilling me, but over the years I've learned to be calm and just, answer his questions. And finally, after about 10 minutes, my client just stood up and bammed the table and said, "I can't take this any longer. Just give her to work and get out of my office." So I have to say that I personally have evolved in dealing with the situation, but it still happens, and it's amazing to me that in 2013 that those type of people are still walking around and really making those comments. I mean, it's bad to think about it, but it's even worse to voice it. But it's happening. So we still need inclusion programs, because it will not happen. And for all the young women and minorities coming up behind me, if they don't have some type of way to enter, they will not have a chance.
So that's a perfect segue to networking. But I just want to say, Pam and I will help you write your book, because because these are stories that women need to hear. They really do. And I also just want to say that Daryl's company did the renovation on the Treasury building some years ago, and I just want to say, every time I walk by that building, how proud I am to say I know the person who was involved in doing all of that work on that building. I mean, it just really makes you proud to see that kind of thing. And $1 billion building, wonderful. That's wonderful. So, I mean, but this is a good segue into networking. And we think things have really changed, and a lot of things have changed. A lot of doors are open, but there still is a need. There's always been a need for networking, and women, in many ways, even though they were the auxiliary of, networked with each other. We just didn't call it that. And Pam, I know you have a perspective on how we got to the point where we are in networking, and I know, Daryl, you can then talk to us about why it's still important to do it and some examples.
Okay, great. Yes, absolutely. And one of the things that Daryl already mentioned is information. You get information from networks. So networking has always happened. It's happened since the beginning of time, but nobody used that term. Nobody was aware of it in the sense that we have become. And it's really right. It's just amazing, because it's impossible, I think, to go through a professional day without somebody mentioning networking, mentoring, and role models, perhaps less frequently. But networking is everywhere. We don't do receptions anymore. We have networking events. And yet, 40 years ago, the only people who used the term were sociologists. And that is rather surprising, but the reason is that in the decade after the passage of the Civil Rights Act, underrepresented minorities and women flooded business at the entry level. By 72, 73, 74, they were saying, okay, we're here at the bottom, why aren't we moving up? Why aren't we doing better? And a lot of women organized groups, and there were African American men who organized groups within their companies to say, okay, we know we're missing something. And what they were missing was information. They were missing helpful hints. What do you wear to a company event? How do you behave? Who's the person to go to ask a certain kind of question? And so they said, okay, nobody else will talk to us about it. We're going to form our own groups. And some of these groups started reading sociologists. And in those sociology books, they saw words mentoring, networking, gatekeeping, role models. They saw those words and they gradually adopted them. So, for example, I found that in the 73, 74, you'd see those words turning up in advice to women kind of books, and they would be in quotes, and they'd have little explanations for them. By 75, 76, 77, the quotes were gone, the definitions were gone, everybody knew what everybody was talking about. And by the early 80s, there were articles in the Harvard Business Review and other places of that nature with the title Mentormania, and so on. And so, for example, I was able to document, actually, in a variety of ways that I think Bill Becker would be interested in, but probably nobody else here. But I was actually able to show that it was through women's activities that networking came into the business and everyday language. So this was actually a result of the women's movement, and now it's everywhere. And there's a way of thinking about this that we learn how our bodies work, how our cars work, how our jobs work when they don't work. When something goes wrong is how we learn. And the people for whom the system was not working, this so-called meritocracy that American business, government, military, and so on were supposed to be, the people for whom it wasn't working were outside of it and say, what's wrong? And they realized that what was wrong was that they did not have access to networks of opportunity. And so they said, okay, we'll form our own. And so, for example, at my university, University of Colorado, Denver, I have formed, as a part of my service activities, a group for non-tenure track faculty, because they tend not to know what's going on. And they come to the meetings and say, oh, I didn't know that, this, that, and the other thing. So it's about information, it's about opportunities, it's about credit, it's about getting people to care who you are and wanting to help you. But if they don't know, if they don't see you face to face, they have no investment in you. So women and minorities actually brought these terms and the dynamics awareness into our everyday culture. And it's really important, and one of the reasons why I think that the National Women's History Museum is important, along with other women's groups, the American Association of University Women, Business and Professional Women's Inc., and so on, is that there are really different kinds of networking that we need to do. We need to have nurturing networking where we teach each other how to value ourselves, how to behave, what's important. And then we need to have access to the networks where the opportunity is, which probably isn't going to be just in the women's networks, although now that I know Daryl, I'm connected. I feel much, it's true, just one person could connect me with a whole lot of other opportunities, if you would be so kind. And so...
That's how you get it done, is you have to ask. If you don't ask, it doesn't happen, right?
So the point is that we need to have different kinds of networks and think about them strategically. But I know too many women who've said, oh, I don't need to belong to the women's networks anymore. I don't need to go to the women's lunch anymore. And so I think they're wrong. Which is not to say that they shouldn't also go to the other organizations, because that's where everyone else is, and where we all get together across all kinds of categories and knowledge and so on. So it's something that, as I say, people have always done it, but it was women who started talking about it and taught everybody else.
I'm thinking of an example at Harvard Business School. The small group of women alumni created a women's affinity group. And the alumni body wasn't used to that. It's like everybody is supposed to be together and we can't really support an affinity group. But that group became so strong and so supportive and helped other women. But those women are also involved in the bigger organization. But now affinity groups have been formed at universities all over the country. But you do both. You don't just do one. You can do more than one. So, Daryl, you are a mentor and you have been mentored. Examples.
Okay. I just wanted to add one thing about networking. I was looking at television this week, and there was a news clip of George Washington. I don't know how many people saw that, but he used a ring of spies to help him make key decisions when he was the president. And one of them was a woman. And Joan, you should look into that. I just wanted to put that out there. But networking is very key, and I do have 3 key mentors that are in different parts of the country that mentor me on different things. One of them I've had since I was 13, so she knows me the most. And the other 2 I've had maybe about 20 years, and the other one 10. And it's so key because they've been where I am, and that's always going to be the case. And so they offer me so much confirmation on the decisions that I make. And I am just now at a point where I feel that I have something to talk to young people about. For so many years, I was on the job training. At least I felt like I was, and I didn't think I had much to share, but I think I'm now definitely at that point where I can share because I do have something to share. Networking in my business is super important because for someone to hand over their construction to you or their design to you, it's sort of chemistry and a trustworthy relationship. So you have to build enough of a bond that they have confidence in you. And they really forget what color you are, what your gender is, if they trust you, if you have this connection. And that comes through networking. The other thing that's important for us as networking is intelligence. So now we've built up a portfolio of work. We have key leaders. We can put people on a job. But if we don't know about it, we can't go after it. And our business is getting more and more sophisticated every day in terms of business development. So when it used to be years ago that we could just respond to an RFP, I mean, we had to get on the list to get an RFP, but you could just respond. Now we're looking a year in advance. I just want a job that I worked on for 2 years. So we need that intelligence that early in the game in order to have a chance at winning the job. I love my networking stories. Okay, so you talked about Treasury, and I have to tell you, I got that job networking. I was invited to a reception at the Secretary of Treasury's cash room in the Treasury building, and he was there. And I got a chance to meet him. And I told him my story, I told him my history, and he says, "Oh, well, you should be doing work for us. Let me introduce you to the head of procurement." So he did. And it doesn't stop at that. I always say, you can network and meet people, but if you aren't persistent, it's just not going to happen. So that head of procurement, I would go see every 2 weeks, and I did it for 2 years. And finally, after 2 years, he said, "Give her something to get her out of here. I'm just tired of seeing her every 2 weeks." So they gave me a small contract to do some design reviews for an electrical distribution unit at the Treasury building they were going to put in. And so late that night, the phone rings, and this guy says, "Can I speak to Mr. McKissick?" And I said, "Well, he's dead." And so I had dinner and I had my little glass of wine, so I was feeling pretty nice. So he said, "Well, the Treasury." No, I said, "Tell me another story." He said, "Well, this is the Secret Service." Oh, and I just fell out laughing. I said, "I don't even know why I'm talking to you." And they said, "Lady, the Treasury building is on fire." I said, "Look, I just left downtown. I didn't see any smoke." So he said, "Well, why don't you turn on your TV?" So I turned on the TV, and there was the Treasury building going up in smoke. And I said, "Oh, my God, this really is the Secret Service. How can I serve my country? I'm trying to clean it up." And so he said, "Well, we need Daryl McKissick to get down here right away." I said, "Well, that's me." You could have said that in the beginning. So to make a long story short, went down there. It was on fire. They were cleaning up. The fire department was leaving. And we were the only people that had an open contract with Treasury. Treasury in the past had always been using GSA to do all of their construction work. So they were getting a new roof on the building, and the GSA roofer started the fire with his blowtorch.
God, I didn't know the details of that story.
Yes. And the secretary was so mad. He said, "I don't want GSA to touch my building. Is there anybody who has a construction contract?" Wow. And that just happened to be me.
Wow, that is a great story.
Okay.
So we have about 50 more questions that we can ask, but it's time for us to go to the cocktail party. So any parting words of advice or words of information for our audience?
Well, I just think that with networking, as women, it's kind of a natural because we're always talking to people. We do 25,000 words a day. We should be able to do that. We should be able to just talk to people and find out what they do. But, you know, I don't ever try to go into a room and meet everybody. I always have, well, right now, I'm always developing a list of the people that I need to meet and I want to meet. And in the spiritual realm, it always works out. I have always met these people. It's never been a time that I haven't. They've always been one person away from me. So when I walk into a room, I have an idea of what I'm looking for, and I kind of know about the group. And then once I meet those people, I just definitely follow up on it. But one little quick other story. So I'm at an event, and this guy kept trying to, you know, I saw him looking at me, but I didn't know what he was saying. And finally he comes over and he says, "Ooh, I love those shoes." So I'm like, oh, okay, fine. Well, next thing you know, out of the side of my ear, because I always try to be aware of my surroundings, so I do not drink my wine at these receptions. I heard somebody say he was the president of the university that I was trying to get my niece in. And so I just turned around real fast and I said, "Oh my God, you really like these shoes?" So we get into a long discussion, and next thing you know, I said, "I have this niece that's trying to get in this school. You know, it's one of the major universities." And he actually followed her application, and she got into the school. And you know, she was really borderline. Her mother was very worried. But so you never know what you get out of it.
Mm-hmm. I guess what I'd like to add to that is my favorite saying about social capital. Social capital are all the connections and connectability, the ability to be connected, is that social capital helps those who help themselves. I mean, Daryl is obviously charming and a great networker, but she's also a phenomenal architect and engineer. And that's what it takes. So whether you're Andrew Carnegie or John Rockefeller or Daryl McKissick, whatever, it's not just about connections, and connections won't do it. And charm is not enough. These are all necessary and sufficient conditions, and we need to keep in mind that we have to work hard in order to gain the respect and gain the help that our mentors and networks are willing to give us. So it's a combination of necessary and sufficient conditions. But I think these kinds of stories should give us confidence. And knowing that it was indeed women and underrepresented minorities who taught everybody how to do these things and that we should do them. I think that should give us confidence and
It's not just
inspiration
the
as
golf
well.
course. There are lots of other
It is not.
places.
No, it is not.
Thank you so much, Daryl and Pam.
Thank you.